The afternoon sun hung low over the Texas borderlands, bleeding crimson across a sky that seemed to remember every violent deed committed beneath it. Dust devils twisted through the makeshift market square where men gathered not to trade cattle or grain, but something far more sinister. The smell of sweat and desperation hung thick in the air, mixing with the acrid scent of burning mesquite and cheap whiskey. At the center of the crowd stood a wooden platform, weathered and stained dark from years of use that no one spoke about in daylight. Upon it, a man in a stained vest and crooked hat surveyed his merchandise with the casual indifference of someone who had long ago sold whatever remained of his soul. His laugh cut through the murmur of the crowd like a rusty blade. "Money back if she doesn't please you," he announced, his voice dripping with mockery. His eyes, small and mean, fixed on the young woman bound to the post behind him. She stood there trembling, her dress torn at the shoulder, her dark hair matted with dirt and dried blood. But her eyes, those were what struck anyone who dared to look. They burned with a defiance that hadn't yet been broken, though it flickered like a candle in a storm. The crowd of cowboys and drifters erupted in laughter, their voices harsh and eager. Horses stamped their hooves against the hard-packed earth, sensing the ugliness in the air. Hands reached for coin purses, eyes measured and assessed, reducing a human being to a transaction no different from a horse or a wagon wheel. But in the back of the gathering, beyond the circle of greedy faces and grasping hands, stood a figure who hadn't joined the laughter. He was tall, though not exceptionally so, wearing a long duster coat that had seen better years. The leather was cracked and faded, marked with the kind of wear that spoke of long miles and hard weather. His hat sat low over his eyes, and a dusty bandana covered the lower half of his face, revealing only a narrow strip of sun-weathered skin and eyes that seemed carved from stone. He didn't move with the restless energy of the other men. He simply stood there, watching, his hands hanging loose at his sides. There was something about his stillness that made him more noticeable than the loudest voice in the crowd, like a hole in the noise where something dangerous waited. The dealer noticed him. Men like the dealer always noticed the quiet ones. They were either easy marks or dangerous customers, and experience had taught him to know the difference. This one, he couldn't quite read. The stranger's eyes met his across the distance, and for just a moment, the dealer felt something cold walk down his spine. Then the moment passed, and greed won out over instinct, as it always did. The dealer turned back to his prize, yanking the rope that bound the woman's wrists, forcing her to stumble forward. She nearly fell, catching herself at the last moment, and the crowd cheered at her indignity. Fresh from the mines, the dealer continued his pitch, though his voice had taken on a slightly harder edge. Her daddy thought he could keep a claim all to himself. Thought wrong, as it turns out. Now she's available to the highest bidder. Strong back, good teeth, and a spirit that just needs a firm hand to break it proper. The woman's jaw clenched, her eyes blazing, but she kept her silence. Silence, she had learned, was sometimes the only thing they couldn't take from you. Bids began to fly, ugly numbers shouted out like bets at a cockfight. The dealer's smile widened with each increase, showing teeth that had gone bad years ago. He was already counting his profit, already thinking about the whiskey he'd buy and the poker game he'd join once the sun went down. Then the quiet man moved. He walked forward with the kind of deliberate calm that made the crowd part without quite knowing why. His boots made soft sounds on the dirt, each step measured, each movement economical. As he approached the platform, the noise began to die down, conversations trailing off into uncertain silence. The dealer watched him come, his smile faltering slightly. Up close, he could see the scars that marked the stranger's hands, the kind of marks that came from hard living and harder choices. There was a revolver at his hip, worn but well-maintained, and the way it sat suggested a man who knew how to use it better than he knew how to talk. The stranger reached the platform and looked up at the woman. For a long moment, their eyes met, hers filled with fear and fury, his revealing nothing at all. Then, without a word, he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He tossed it onto the wooden table beside the platform, and it landed with the heavy clink of gold coin. The dealer's eyes widened. He grabbed the pouch, fingers fumbling with the drawstring, and when he looked inside, his breath caught. More than the highest bid. More than he'd expected to see in a month. He looked up at the stranger, suspicion and avarice warring in his expression. "Don't you want to inspect the merchandise first?" the dealer asked, his voice taking on an oily quality. "Make sure she's worth the price? I stand by my guarantee, after all. Money back if she doesn't please you." The stranger didn't answer. He simply climbed onto the platform, each movement slow and deliberate, and walked to where the woman stood bound. The dealer moved aside instinctively, though he wasn't quite sure why. The crowd pressed closer, eager to see what would happen next, to witness whatever came next in this transaction. The stranger pulled a knife from his belt, and the woman flinched, expecting violence, but instead of using it on her, he cut through the ropes that bound her wrists with two quick strokes. The hemp fell away, and she stumbled slightly, catching herself against the post. Her wrists were raw beneath where the ropes had bitten, red and bleeding in places. The stranger sheathed his knife without looking at it, his attention never leaving her face. Then he did something that made the entire crowd fall silent. He removed his own coat and held it out to her. Not demanding, not insisting, simply offering. She stared at it as if it might be a trap, as if kindness itself had become something so foreign she could no longer recognize it. Her hands trembled as they reached out, not quite touching the worn leather, not quite pulling away. "Come on," the dealer shouted, breaking the strange tension of the moment. "You paid for her, she's yours. Take what you bought, friend. No one here's judging how you treat your property." The stranger finally spoke, and his voice was low, rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "She's not property." Then he turned and walked off the platform, not looking back to see if she would follow. He went to where a roan horse stood tied to a post, its saddlebags heavy with supplies. He checked the straps, adjusted the reins, and waited. The woman stood frozen on the platform, the coat still hanging from the stranger's extended hand in her mind, though he'd already walked away. Around her, the crowd began to murmur, confusion replacing their earlier enthusiasm. This wasn't how these things usually went. Men who paid good money for women at the slave market didn't cut them loose and offer them coats. They didn't walk away and wait patiently as if the choice to follow belonged to anyone but them. The dealer spat into the dust, his moment of good fortune turning sour in his mouth. "Your loss, friend," he called out. "But a deal's a deal. No refunds for buyer's remorse." The stranger mounted his horse in one smooth motion. He sat there in the saddle, silhouetted against the lowering sun, and finally he looked back at her. Just once. Just a glance that somehow contained both a question and an answer, an invitation and a release. The woman looked down at her raw wrists, at the platform beneath her feet, at the faces of the men who surrounded her with their hungry eyes and grasping hands. Then she looked at the stranger on his horse, at the open desert beyond him, at the possibility of something other than what she'd known. She moved. It wasn't a run, though everything in her screamed to run. It was a walk, steady and deliberate, off the platform and through the crowd. Men reached out as she passed, whether to stop her or touch her. She didn't know and didn't wait to find out. She kept her eyes fixed on the stranger, on the horse, on the horizon line where earth met sky. When she reached him, he held down his hand. She took it, and he pulled her up behind him with surprising gentleness. The coat he'd offered her somehow appeared in his other hand, and he passed it back to her without a word. She took it, wrapping it around her shoulders, and the warmth of it made something in her chest crack open just slightly. The stranger touched his heels to the horse's flanks, and they began to move. Not quickly, not as if they were fleeing, but with the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going and had no fear of being followed. The crowd watched them go, and slowly, like men waking from a strange dream, they began to laugh and jeer, making crude jokes about what the stranger would do with his purchase once he got her alone. But the stranger never looked back, and neither did the woman. They rode out of the market square as the sun touched the horizon, two silhouettes against the dying light, and behind them, the dealer counted his coins and tried to forget the look in the stranger's eyes when he'd said those three words. She's not property. The desert stretched before them, vast and merciless, painted in shades of orange and purple by the setting sunday. The horse's hooves crunched against loose stone and hard sand, a rhythm as old as time itself. Behind them, The sounds of the market faded into the distance until there was nothing but the whisper of wind across empty space and the creak of leather saddle. The woman held onto the stranger's coat with one hand and gripped the back of the saddle with the other. She could feel the warmth of him in front of her, solid and real, but she kept her distance as much as the horse's back would allow. Her mind raced with questions and fears, with the desperate calculations of someone who had learned that survival meant always thinking 3 moves ahead. Who was this man? What did he really want? No one paid that much gold out of simple kindness, not in a world where kindness itself had become a commodity more rare than water in the desert. There had to be a reason. There was always a reason. The stranger rode in silence, his eyes scanning the horizon with the kind of alertness that spoke of long experience. He never relaxed, never let his guard down, and she noticed the way his hand never strayed far from the gun at his hip. Whatever else he might be, he was a man who understood danger, who knew how to watch for it. As twilight deepened into true darkness, he finally brought the horse to a stop near an outcropping of rock that would provide some shelter from the wind. He dismounted in one fluid motion, and she found herself suddenly unsure whether to remain on the horse or get down. The decision was made for her when he held up his hand again, the same gesture of assistance he'd offered before. She hesitated, then accepted his help down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, weakness and fear and the long day finally catching up with her. He steadied her briefly, then immediately let go, stepping back to give her space. That was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Men who bought women didn't give them space. They didn't steady them gently and then step back. They took what they believed they owned. He moved to the horse and began unpacking supplies with the efficient movements of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. A bedroll, a canteen, dried meat wrapped in cloth, a small pot for making coffee. He worked in silence, and she stood there watching him, her body tensed for whatever came next. What came next was fire. He gathered dried brush and struck sparks from flint and steel until a small flame caught and grew. The warmth of it pushed back the desert cold that had begun to creep in with the night. He set the pot on the fire with water from the canteen, then settled back against the rock face, his hat low over his eyes. "You should eat," he said without looking at her. "There's meat in the saddlebag." She didn't move, couldn't move. The words felt like a trap, though she couldn't see the mechanism of it. He sighed, a sound that held more weariness than impatience. "I'm not going to hurt you." "Everyone says that," she replied, surprised by the sound of her own voice. It came out harder than she'd intended, sharp with the edges of trauma not yet scabbed over. He nodded slowly, as if this was a reasonable response. "True enough. So why should I believe you?" He was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, though no less rough. "You shouldn't. Belief requires trust, and you have no reason to trust anyone. Least of all me." The honesty of it caught her off guard. She'd expected lies, expected persuasion, expected the slow manipulation that men used when they wanted something. She hadn't expected simple truth. "Then why?" she asked, and the word came out almost broken. "Why buy me? What do you want?" He looked up at her then, and in the firelight, she could finally see his face clearly. It was lined and weathered, marked by the kind of hard living that aged a man before his time. There was a scar across his left cheek, pale against tanned skin, and his eyes, those eyes carried something that looked like old grief worn smooth by years. "I want to get you somewhere safe," he said, "somewhere those men can't reach you." "Why?" He looked back at the fire. "Because I couldn't save the others." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. But something in the way he said it, in the depth of pain that flickered across his face, made her believe that at least in this moment, he was telling the truth. She moved slowly to the saddlebag and found the wrapped meat. Her stomach cramped with hunger, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in 2 days. She took a small piece and retreated back to her spot, watching him warily as she ate. He didn't watch her, didn't comment, just sat there against the rock, apparently lost in his own thoughts. Eventually, he poured coffee when the water boiled and offered her a cup. She took it, cradling the warmth in her damaged hands, and let the bitter liquid chase away some of the cold that had settled into her bones. "What's your name?" she asked finally. He took a long moment to answer, as if the question required consideration. Eli, I'm Lila. He nodded slowly. Lila, he repeated, as if testing the weight of it. That's a good name. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They sat in silence as the fire burned down and the desert night deepened around them. Above, stars emerged in their thousands, bright and cold and indifferent to the small dramas of human suffering played out beneath them. Eventually, Eli spread out the bedroll near the fire and stood up. You take that, he said. I'll keep watch. You can't stay awake all night. I've done it before. Get some sleep, Lila. Tomorrow's a long ride. She wanted to argue, wanted to protest, but exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. She moved to the bedroll and lay down, still wearing his coat, still not quite trusting, but too tired to maintain the vigilance any longer. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was Eli sitting with his back to the rock, his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire's light. And for the first time in weeks, she slept without nightmares. The sun rose harsh and unforgiving, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Lila woke to find Eli already up, the fire reduced to cold ashes, the horse saddled and ready. He handed her a canteen and more dried meat without comment, and they set off again into the vastness. The morning passed in silence. The land around them grew more desolate, more barren, as if they were riding away from the world itself. Lila found herself studying Eli as they rode, trying to understand the puzzle he presented. The way he moved spoke of military training, each gesture precise and controlled. The scars on his hands weren't just from hard work. They were from violence, from combat. And the gun at his hip had the worn grip of a weapon used often. He was a killer. She knew that instinctively. But what kind of killer bought women at slave markets just to set them free? Around midday, Eli suddenly tensed. His hand moved to his rifle, and he reined the horse to a stop. Lila felt it too, a moment later, that primitive awareness that something was wrong. The desert was too quiet, the normal sounds of insects and distant birds gone silent. 3 men, Eli said quietly. Maybe 4. They've been following since dawn. Terror spiked through her. The slavers? Probably. Or bounty hunters. Doesn't much matter which. He dismounted and helped her down. Stay behind the rocks there. Don't come out, no matter what you hear. What are you going to do? He checked his rifle, his movements calm and methodical. What I'm good at. Before she could respond, he walked out into the open desert, away from the rocks, away from her. She crouched behind the stone, her heart hammering, watching as 3 men on horseback emerged from a gully to the east. They spread out as they approached, their intentions clear in the way they held their weapons. The leader, a man in a battered duster with a face like old leather, called out across the distance. That's valuable property you got there, stranger. The man you bought her from, he's willing to pay double to get her back. Something about she knows where her daddy hid a mine claim. Worth a lot more than what you paid. Eli stood perfectly still, his rifle held loosely in his hands. I don't sell people. The man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Everyone sells people, friend. It's just a matter of price. Now, how about you walk away and leave the woman, and we'll forget we saw you. No need for bloodshed over something that ain't even yours to begin with. She's not something, Eli said, his voice carrying across the space between them. She's someone, and she's under my protection now. The 3 men exchanged glances, and Lila saw their decision in the shift of their postures. They thought Eli was just one man. They thought 3 against 1 was good odds. They thought wrong. What happened next occurred so quickly that Lila almost couldn't follow it. The man on the right went for his gun, and Eli moved. His rifle came up in one smooth motion, and the first shot cracked across the desert before the other man had even cleared leather. The bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. The other 2 opened fire, but Eli was already moving, rolling behind a low rise in the ground, coming up in a new position. His second shot dropped one of the horses, sending its rider tumbling. The third shot, impossibly precise, disarmed the leader without killing him, the bullet catching his gun hand and sending his weapon spinning away. The whole encounter lasted perhaps 10 seconds. When it was over, one man was wounded, another was trapped under his dead horse, and the leader was clutching his mangled hand and cursing. Eli stood up slowly, his rifle still trained on them, his breathing barely elevated. "Ride back and tell whoever sent you that Lila is protected," he said, his voice cold as winter stone. "Tell them that anyone who comes after her will meet the same fate, only next time I won't aim to wound. Tell them her freedom has been paid for in full, and the receipt is written in gunpowder." The leader stared at him with eyes full of pain and recognition. "I know you," he said, his voice strained. "From the war. You're Eli Blackwood. They said you died at Shiloh." Eli's jaw tightened. "I did." He fired one more shot into the air, and the sound sent the remaining horses bolting. The three men scrambled to their feet and ran, stumbling over rocks and scrub, not looking back. Lila watched them disappear into the heat haze, then slowly emerged from behind the rocks. Eli was checking his rifle, his hands steady despite what had just happened. But when she looked at his face, she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a darkness, a weight that seemed to pull at him from the inside. "You were a soldier," she said, statement not question. He didn't answer for a long moment. Then, once, a long time ago, "You killed people." "Yes." The simple admission hung between them. Lila felt her mind reeling, trying to reconcile the man who had gently cut her bonds and offered her his coat with the cold precision of the killer she'd just witnessed. Both were real. Both were him. And that terrified her more than anything else. She walked back to where he stood and saw blood on his arm where a bullet had grazed him. Without thinking, she reached out to examine the wound, and he flinched at her touch. Not from pain, but from surprise, as if kindness directed at him was something foreign and unwelcome. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing. It's bleeding. Let me wrap it." She tore a strip from her already tattered dress and bound the wound with gentle efficiency. Her fingers shook slightly, but she did the work anyway, and he stood there and let her, his eyes focused somewhere on the distant horizon. When she finished, he looked down at her hands, at the careful knot she'd tied, and something in his expression softened just fractionally. "Thank you. You saved my life. I endangered it by buying you in the first place. Those men wouldn't have come if not for me." "They would have come anyway," Lila said, and the truth of it was bitter in her mouth. "They were always going to come. At least this way, I'm not alone when they do." Eli looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something in his eyes that might have been respect, or perhaps recognition. One survivor seeing another. "We need to keep moving," he said finally. "They'll be back with more men." "Where are we going?" "North. There's a town called Salvation Creek, about 5 days' ride. You'll be safe there. The sheriff is a good man, and the marshal owes me a favor." "What about you?" He turned away, moving toward the horse. "I'll make sure you get there. That's all that matters." But it wasn't all that mattered, and they both knew it. Something had shifted in the desert between them. Some unspoken understanding that they were bound together now by circumstance and by choice. And whatever came next, they would face it together. They rode hard for the rest of the day, putting distance between themselves and the slavers. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the land around them grew even more hostile, sharp rocks and thorny scrub that seemed to reach out with malicious intent. But Eli knew this country, knew where to find water and where to avoid the worst of the terrain. As evening approached and they made camp in the shadow of a redstone mesa, Lila finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind all day. "Why did you do it?" "Really? You could have ridden past that market without stopping. You could have kept your gold and your conscience clear. So why?" Eli was building the fire, his movements mechanical, practiced. He didn't look up when he answered. "My conscience hasn't been clear in 15 years. Hasn't been clear since the war." "What happened in the war?" His hands stilled on the kindling. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, I did what soldiers do. I followed orders. I burned villages and shot men and told myself it was for a cause, for something bigger than any one life. And when it was over, when the South fell and we all went home, I realized that all those causes and flags and grand ideas didn't mean anything compared to the people who died for them." "You were Confederate," Lila said slowly, pieces falling into place. "I was." The words were heavy, laden with regret. "I was a captain in the Tennessee Regiment. We marched through Georgia, through Alabama, and we left nothing but ash behind us. I told myself we were soldiers, that we were fighting for our way of life. It took me years to understand that our way of life was built on the suffering of people like you. The truth of it settled over them like a shroud. Lila felt something cold and hard forming in her chest, a knot of anger and betrayal that she couldn't quite name. And now what? You think buying one slave makes up for all the others? You think one act of kindness erases what you did? No, Eli said, and his voice was raw with pain. No, I don't. Nothing can erase that. Nothing can make it right. But I can't go back and undo what I did. All I can do is try to save the people I can save now. Starting with you. Why me? He finally looked up at her, and she saw tears tracking through the dust on his face. Because you remind me of someone. A girl in a village in Alabama. She couldn't have been more than 16. She begged me not to burn her home. Begged me to spare her family. And I did it anyway. Because I had orders. Because I was a soldier. And soldiers follow orders. The firelight danced between them, casting shadows that seemed to hold the ghosts of all the unnamed dead. She died in that fire? Lila asked quietly. I don't know. We rode on the next day, and I never looked back. I spent 15 years trying not to look back, but I see her face every night when I close my eyes. I hear her voice. And when I saw you on that platform, bound and afraid and defiant despite it all, I saw her again. And I thought, maybe, just this once, I could do the right thing. Maybe I could save one person, even if I couldn't save her. Lila felt something crack inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever, but understanding, at least. Understanding that the man in front of her was as much a prisoner as she had been, trapped by his past, trying desperately to atone for sins that could never be fully repaid. My father was a free man, she said, and her voice shook with the weight of memory. He found a gold claim in the mountains, a good one, rich enough to make us wealthy, to change our lives. But the white men in town, they wanted it. They told him to sell, offered him nothing, threatened him when he refused. One night, they came to our house. They beat him until he told them where the claim was. Then they killed him anyway. Eli's face had gone rigid, his jaw clenched tight. They took me, Lila continued. Kept me locked up, thought they could break me, make me tell them more. But I never did. I held on to that secret because it was the last thing my father gave me. The last piece of him that they couldn't take. And when they finally decided I was worthless, they sold me to that market. I'm sorry, Eli said, and the words seemed inadequate, hollow in the face of such pain. Sorry doesn't bring him back. Sorry doesn't undo what was done. No, it doesn't. They sat in silence as the fire burned low. The night sounds of the desert crept in around them, distant coyotes and the rustle of things moving in the darkness. And between them, an understanding formed, fragile as spider silk, but real nonetheless. They were both survivors of a war that had never truly ended, both carrying scars that would never fully heal. But they were alive. And tomorrow, they would ride on. The days blurred together in a rhythm of riding and resting, of long silences broken only by necessary words. Eli taught Lila how to shoot, how to read the land, how to spot danger before it spotted them. She proved to be a quick student, her survival instincts honed by hardship into something sharp and reliable. They grew comfortable with each other in the way that people do when survival depends on trust. She no longer flinched when he moved suddenly. He no longer worried that she might bolt in the night. They became something close to partners, united by circumstance and by the growing understanding that they needed each other. But the past was never far behind. On the fourth day out from the market, they saw dust rising on the horizon, the telltale sign of riders coming fast. Eli tensed immediately, his hand moving to his rifle. How many? Lila asked, her voice steady. 6, maybe 8. Too many to fight in the open. They were in bad country for a chase, flat desert with nowhere to hide. But Eli's eyes scanned the landscape with the trained gaze of a tactician, and he spotted what he was looking for, a dry riverbed cutting through the hardpan, its banks high enough to provide cover. They reached it with minutes to spare, sending the horse down into the cut and taking position behind the natural fortification of stone and earth. Eli checked his rifle and his revolvers, his face calm despite the approaching danger. Lila clutched the pistol he'd given her hands steady on the grip. The riders appeared, a rough group of men led by someone Lila recognized, with a jolt of fear that went straight to her core. Marcus Crawford, the mine foreman who had killed her father. He sat his horse like a king, surveying his domain, his eyes scanning the empty desert. "I know you're here, girl," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "We tracked you all the way from the market. That cowboy can't protect you forever. Just come on out, tell us where the gold is, and we'll make it quick. Keep fighting, and we'll make you watch him die slow before we start on you." Eli's finger moved to the trigger, but Lila put her hand on his arm, stopping him. She stood up slowly, deliberately, showing herself above the riverbank. Eli hissed her name, but she ignored him, her eyes fixed on Crawford. "You want the gold?" she called out. "You want what my father died protecting?" Crawford's face split into a cruel smile. "That's right, girl. That's all we want. You give us the map, and we'll let you and your cowboy ride on out of here. You have my word." "Your word," Lila said, and she laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Your word is worth as much as my father's life was to you, which is to say, nothing at all." She raised the pistol, aimed with the skills Eli had taught her, and fired. The shot went wide. She was still learning, but it sent a clear message. Crawford's expression went from smug to furious in an instant. "Kill them both?" he snarled. The desert erupted in gunfire. Eli pulled Lila down into cover as bullets kicked up dirt around them. He returned fire with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed, each one finding its mark. 2 men fell from their horses, a third took a bullet to the leg and tumbled into the dust. But there were too many, and they had too much ammunition. Bullets pinged off the rocks around them, sending chips of stone flying. Lila fired when she could, providing what support she was able. But she was still new to this kind of violence, still learning how to keep her hands steady when death was howling around her. Eli took a bullet in the side, just below his ribs. She saw him flinch, saw blood blossom dark against his shirt, but he didn't stop, didn't slow down. He just shifted position, found a better angle, and kept shooting. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When the smoke finally cleared, 5 men lay dead or dying in the desert, and the remaining 3 were in full retreat, including Crawford. Eli had stood up to take a final shot at them, but collapsed before he could fire. Lila caught him, her arms barely able to support his weight. "Eli, Eli, stay with me." He looked up at her, his face pale beneath the dust and blood. "Did we get them?" "You got them. Most of them." "Good." His eyes started to close. No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to save me and then die. You hear me, Eli Blackwood? You don't get to leave me alone out here." His eyes opened again, focusing on her face with effort. "You're strong enough. You don't need me." "Maybe I am, but I want you anyway." The words came out fierce, desperate. "You made me a promise. You said you'd get me to Salvation Creek. You don't break your promises, soldier." Something in that word, soldier, seemed to reach him. Some old discipline, some habit of duty that ran deeper than pain or blood loss. He nodded, just slightly. "Help me up." It took everything she had to get him back on the horse. She bound his wound as best she could with strips torn from her dress, but the blood kept coming, slow and steady. They rode through the rest of the day and into the night, Lila holding Eli in the saddle, whispering to him when his head began to droop, telling him stories about her father, about the gold mine, about anything that would keep him conscious and fighting. The storm hit them just before dawn, a desert thunderstorm that came out of nowhere with lightning that split the sky and rain that fell in sheets. They found shelter in an abandoned line shack, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was enough. Lila got Eli inside and onto the floor, then set about building a fire from wood that was miraculously dry in a box by the door. By the light of the flames, she examined his wound properly. The bullet had gone through, which was good, but he'd lost a lot of blood, and fever was already beginning to burn in him. She cleaned the wound with whiskey from his saddlebag, packed it with cloth, and did everything she could remember from watching her mother tend to injured miners. For 3 days, the fever raged. Eli thrashed and mumbled, lost in dreams that seemed to be more nightmare than memory. He called out names she didn't recognize, begged forgiveness from people who were long dead. And through it all, Lila stayed beside him, cooling his fever with wet cloths, forcing water between his lips, refusing to let him slip away into whatever darkness called to him. On the third night, when the fever finally broke and Eli opened his eyes with something like clarity, the first thing he saw was Lila's face, exhausted but determined, backlit by firelight. "You're still here," he said, his voice a rasp. "Where else would I be?" "Safe. You could have taken the horse, ridden to Salvation Creek without me." "I could have." She squeezed water from a cloth over his lips. "But I didn't." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment, considering. "Because you bought my freedom with your gold, and now you're buying it with your blood. Because you could have left me on that platform, and you didn't. Because somewhere in all this darkness, you're trying to be a good man, and that matters to me." Eli closed his eyes, and she thought he'd fallen back asleep. But then he spoke again. "I'm not a good man, Lila. Good men don't do what I've done." "No, but you're a man trying to be better. And maybe that's close enough." His hand found hers in the darkness, and they sat that way as the storm raged outside and the fire burned low. Two people broken by violence, trying to find their way back to something resembling human in a world that seemed determined to grind them to dust. When dawn came, Eli was able to sit up. By afternoon, he could stand. His wound was healing clean, against all odds, and though he was weak, there was strength returning to his limbs. They stayed in the line shack for another day, letting him recover, and in that time, something shifted between them again. It was Lila who spoke the truth they'd both been avoiding. "I know where the mine is." Eli looked up from the fire he was tending. "Your father's claim?" "Yes. He showed me before he died, made me memorize the map. Said that knowledge was power, and they could kill him, but they couldn't kill what he'd taught me. You could be rich. If we can get there. If we can file the claim before Crawford finds us. It's dangerous. He'll be waiting. Everything's dangerous. Everything's been dangerous since the day those men came to our house. At least this way, I'm fighting for something instead of just running." Eli studied her face, seeing the determination there, the fire that hadn't been broken despite everything she'd endured. "Then we'll go. When I'm strong enough, we'll go together. You could take your share. For helping me?" He shook his head. "That gold belongs to you. It's your father's legacy. I'm just the man making sure you live to claim it." They left the line shack 2 days later, riding slower now, but with purpose. Lila guided them based on her father's instructions, through canyons and over ridges, following landmarks that only she knew. The mine was in the high country, in a place so remote that few men had ever bothered to look there. It took them 3 days to reach it, 3 days of hard climbing and nervous watching for pursuit. But when they finally stood at the entrance to the mine shaft, hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural but was actually carefully arranged, Lila felt her breath catch. "He did it," she whispered. "He really found it." Eli checked the surrounding area, his soldiers' instincts alert for ambush. But the place was deserted, untouched, since the last time Lila's father had been there. They explored carefully, finding not just gold ore but actual nuggets, some as big as a fist, lying in the back of the shaft where her father had collected them. "This is wealth beyond imagining," Eli said softly. "You could live like a queen." "I don't want to live like a queen. I just want to live free." They were gathering samples to take to the land office when they heard it. Voices, the clatter of horses on stone. Crawford had found them. Eli moved instantly into combat mode, positioning himself between Leela and the mine entrance. "How many horses do you hear?" She listened. 3, maybe 4. Still too many. He checked his guns, his face grim. "There's a back way out of this canyon?" "I don't know. My father never mentioned one." "Then we make our stand here." Crawford and 3 men appeared at the mouth of the canyon, their guns already drawn. The mine foreman's face was twisted with rage and greed, any pretense of civilization burned away by his obsession. "End of the line, girl. You've led us right to it. We'll be taking that claim now." Eli stepped forward, his stance wide and balanced. "Over my dead body." Crawford laughed. "That can be arranged." What happened next happened fast. Crawford's men spread out, trying to flank them, but Eli had chosen his position well. The canyon walls provided cover, and the mine entrance gave them something to defend. Gunfire erupted, echoing off stone walls until it was impossible to tell how many shots were being fired. Eli fought with the cold precision of his military training, each shot deliberate, each movement calculated. But he was still weak from his wound, still slower than he should have been. A bullet caught him in the leg, dropping him to one knee. Another grazed his shoulder. Lila fired her pistol until it clicked empty, then grabbed Eli's spare revolver and kept shooting. She wasn't skilled, but she was determined, and her bullets forced Crawford's men to stay in cover, unable to advance. But they were running out of ammunition, running out of time. Crawford knew it too. He smiled as he reloaded, taking his time, knowing they were trapped. You fought well, cowboy. Respect for that, but it's over now. Throw down your guns, and I'll make it quick. Eli looked at Lila, his face pale but his eyes steady. I'm sorry I couldn't get you all the way to safety. You got me farther than anyone else would have. He smiled, just a little, then turned back to Crawford. Come and take us then, but you'll pay for it in blood. Crawford raised his gun, took aim at Eli's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. The shot rang out across the canyon. But it wasn't Crawford who fired. The sound came from above, from the canyon rim, where a figure stood silhouetted against the afternoon sky. The bullet caught Crawford in the shoulder, spinning him around. More shots followed, and Crawford's men scrambled for cover, suddenly finding themselves caught in a crossfire. The figure on the rim was joined by others, half a dozen men in duster coats and marshal's badges. They poured fire down into the canyon with professional efficiency, and within moments, Crawford's gang was finished. Two lay dead, one was wounded, and Crawford himself was on his knees, clutching his bloody shoulder. A man climbed down into the canyon, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He was older, gray-haired, and weathered, with the kind of face that had seen too much but still maintained its integrity. He looked at Eli and nodded. Blackwood. Figured I'd find you in trouble. Marshal Brennan. Eli managed a weak smile. You always did have good timing. Got word from the Salvation Creek sheriff that someone was hunting a woman for a mine claim. Thought it might be related to that favor you called in. Looks like I was right. Brennan looked at Lila, tipping his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. Miss, are you all right? I am now. Her voice shook slightly, the adrenaline beginning to fade. Thank you. Thank Eli. He sent word 3 days ago through a freight rider. Told me you might need help. Brennan turned back to his prisoner. Marcus Crawford, you're under arrest for murder, kidnapping, and attempted robbery. You've got a date with a judge and a rope. Crawford spat blood into the dust, glaring at them all with impotent rage. But he was done, finished, and he knew it. The marshals hauled him and his surviving men away, leaving Eli and Lila alone in the canyon as the sun began to set. Lila looked at Eli, who was leaning heavily against the mine entrance, his face gray with pain and blood loss. You called for help? When? In the line shack, while you were sleeping. Sent a message with a freight rider heading north. Told Brennan to follow our trail, that you'd need protection. You were planning this, all along. I was planning to make sure you survived. That's all I've ever planned. She moved to him, supporting his weight, and helped him sit down. You're bleeding again. I know. You're going to die if we don't get you to a doctor. Maybe. He looked at her, his eyes clear despite the pain. But you're safe now. The marshals will make sure the claim is filed in your name. You'll have your father's legacy. You'll have your freedom. I already have my freedom. You gave me that in the market. This is just money. Money is freedom in this world. Then it's our money, our freedom. You paid for it with your blood, same as I did. Eli shook his head. It's yours, Lila. It was always yours. No. She was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. No, you don't get to do this. You don't get to die on me now. Not after everything. He reached up, touched her face gently, wiping away a tear with his thumb. I'm not afraid of dying. I've been dying for 15 years, ever since the war ended, and I understood what I'd done. Saving you, it's the first thing I've done since then that feels like living. Then live, she said fiercely. Really live. Not just survive. Not just try to atone. Actually live. With me, please. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, some long-held tension releasing. "All right," he whispered. "All right, I'll try." The marshals returned with a wagon, and they took Eli to the nearest town with a doctor. He survived, though it was close. For 3 weeks, he lay in a sickbed, fighting infection and fever, while Lila sat beside him, refusing to leave, refusing to let him slip away. When he finally recovered enough to walk, they rode together to the land office and filed the claim in both their names. Lila insisted, and Eli was too weak to argue. The gold made them wealthy, but more importantly, it made them free. They used the money to build a school in the town where Lila had been sold. A school for children of color, for the children of freed slaves and immigrants, and anyone else who had been denied education by a system designed to keep them down. It opened its doors 2 years after that day in the canyon, a bright building on a hill overlooking the town. On the wall of the main classroom, Lila hung a photograph. It showed a man in a long coat, standing beside a horse, his face weathered but his eyes kind. Beneath it, she placed a small plaque with words she'd written herself. "He didn't buy me to own me. He bought me to set me free." People in town asked about the photograph sometimes, about the stern-faced man who stared out from it with such intensity. And Lila would tell them the story, about the slave market and the cowboy, about the journey through the desert and the battle in the canyon. She told them about a man who spent 15 years trying to atone for the sins of his past, and how he found redemption not in forgetting what he'd done, but in doing better. Some people believed the story. Some thought it was romanticized, sanitized for public consumption. But the children who studied in that school, who learned to read and write and think for themselves, they understood the truth of it. Freedom wasn't something you were given. It was something you fought for, sometimes with guns and sometimes with gold, but always with the determination to keep moving forward no matter how heavy the past weighed on your shoulders. Eli lived long enough to see the school thrive, to see the first generation of students graduate and go out into the world. He never fully forgave himself for what he'd done in the war. Forgiveness, he said, wasn't something he deserved, but he learned to live with it, to carry it without letting it destroy him, to use his past as fuel for building something better. He died peacefully, in his sleep, 23 years after that day in the market. Lila was beside him, holding his hand, and his last words were simple. "Thank you for letting me try." She buried him on the hill behind the school, under a simple marker that bore his name in one line. He bought freedom and paid for it with everything he had. The school stands there still, generations later. The photograph on the wall has faded with time, but the story lives on. Children still learn about the cowboy who walked into a slave market and changed the course of one woman's life. About the woman who turned her father's legacy into a legacy for thousands. About the truth that freedom is never free, but it's always worth fighting for. And on quiet evenings, when the sun sets over the Texas hills and paints the sky the color of blood and gold, people swear they can still see two figures on horseback, riding toward the horizon. A man in a long coat and a woman beside him, free at last, heading toward whatever comes next. Together,